You're listening to the Generational Wealth Through Commercial Real Estate podcast. Your host, Will Smith, is a former NFL player that found his passion in commercial real estate. Every week, you will learn from industry experts everything you need to know to get started investing in commercial real estate to build generational wealth.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. You're listening to the Generational Wealth Through Commercial Real Estate show. Got some really good guests on today. We're going to be talking about 1031 exchanges and how you can use them in commercial real estate. Our first guest that's going to be talking with us is Alex Shandrovsky. I hope I said it right. I know I butchered his name. And then we also have
it's great. It was great.
Yeah, and we also have Michael Brady on the show. And these guys are over at 1031 Madison, and man, they're doing some great things. So, let's listen in and let's learn something that we can use to help us in our investing journey. What's going on, guys? How y'all doing today?
Good, Willie. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. I'm just enjoying life, enjoying the opportunity that's coming before us, man, for real.
Yeah, for sure.
That's very, Willie, it's refreshing. That's the warrior mentality you got, so we appreciate that. Yeah. Mike, do you want to just share a little about your background, and then I'll jump in. I'll tell a little of my story, how I got a complicated last name.
Yeah, well, my uncomplicated last name is not part of the bunch. It's there was a Michael Brady in the Brady bunch, but I only have the three boys. I don't have the three girls, so we're not quite a bunch yet. My background is I am a real estate attorney for many years. For over 26 years, I've been practicing real estate and commercial transaction law. I got involved in doing 1031 exchanges on the qualified intermediary side in 2005, where I ran the East Coast operations for a very large national qualified intermediary company. I've been with Mass in 1031 for about 2 years, guiding our clients through some of the more sophisticated transactions and complex structures. And I also head up our sales and marketing efforts, both through doing events, podcasts like this, and doing seminars for real estate and real estate attorneys, accountants, and real estate brokers and agents nationwide.
Cool.
Awesome. My name is Alex Shandrovsky. I'm an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, so that's where I got my last name. So I got that pleasure and heritage. In terms of my background, it's a little different. I was a small business owner. I ran a large catering company in Silicon Valley, servicing enterprise clients like Facebook and Google. Really glad that I've closed that business down, because boy, is that industry hurting. And I just heard that Facebook just committed to, if you want to work from home until 2021, you're more than welcome to. So that is an interesting piece of news. So that's a very interesting piece of news. And in terms of also some passion of mine when I was in San Francisco is I went into prisons and taught about business and entrepreneurship in maximum secure prisons. And I also hired a lot of second chance employees. And eventually I got a chance to join Mass in 1031. I, as a small business owner, always understood the difference between a W-2 and getting a paycheck and owning assets. So the idea of real estate being the ultimate asset and leveraging 1031 to build multi-generational wealth is really, really exciting, because this tool, once you get to know about it and learn about it, your mind will change.
Right. I know about it, but you can always learn something new. And I know there's going to be some guys that's listening in, or some girls listening in, that this is completely new concept to them, man. So just take your time talking about it, and let's really dig into this.
All right. Should I start, Mike, and then you'll jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, so the basic concept of the 1031 exchange has been in the books for over 100 years in the tax codes. And essentially the theory behind this is following. Willie, whenever any one of your buyers that you're representing or your future investors are buying a property, there's always a silent partner in the back that maybe you don't know about, but he's always there. He's always watching. He's everywhere, and that's the government. Right? So the government is that silent partner, and every time he's behind you, he's with you. sometimes he works for you, sometimes maybe the opposite. But what happens is at the end of when you decide to sell that property, and it's appreciated value, meaning it's risen in value from the time that you purchased it. So for example, you're Northern Carolina, Charlotte, you buy a beautiful property 20 years ago that was $100,000, and then 20 years later now it's $500,000. Well, that has appreciated value, and now Uncle Sam comes at the closing table and says, look, it's time for you to pay me my piece. And that piece could be between state, federal, and local level. Willie, it could be up to 33%.
Wow.
33%. Wow. Uncle Sam says 33%. Well, and of course, but he does give an option for you if you are choosing to reinvest that money in a certain short period of time into the real estate market and go back to Willie and buy another property in a short period of time. Well, you can actually defer capital gains tax, and there's a way that if you continue doing that, you could actually have the capital gains tax wiped out, which we will talk about later on. But the 1031 exchange is a mechanism the government put in place to encourage reinvestment in the market through deferral of capital gains tax by reinvesting.
Okay, so just a quick question around that. Number one, why doesn't more people know about this? Why is this? Because I learned about it when I got into real estate and started kind of, really looking at investing. But, you would think that this would be something that everybody knows about, everybody's talking about if you're talking about real estate investing. So, is there like a myth around this, or, is it, I know some people may say, well, only rich know about this strategy. So could you just touch on that for a second, man?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that nobody's talking about it. So when I first started doing this, the first exchange I ever did was 1994, and I was a young attorney, and I actually had to sell the other side of the deal, the buyers of the property, on allowing my client to do a 1031 exchange, because they, it was an old school attorney, and now I realize the old school, he probably was what the age I am now. But that attorney said, well, I'm a real estate attorney. I don't know anything about taxes. I don't want to get involved, and I actually had to kind of walk him down the garden road and say, look, there's no risk to your client. It's really no different than if we did a standard transaction. Your client's just going to pay somebody else who's going to hold the money, and we're holding you completely, harmless from anything that happens as a result of that. From that time till today, it's far more common and especially on the East Coast. Yeah. On the West Coast, 1031 exchanges were always a very, very popular technique. California in particular, where Alex, resided for quite a while. He mentioned those tax rates he was talking about. The rates are even higher in California. Their income tax rates are in double digits, so you're talking about not just 33%, it's more like 35 to 40%, depending on, what you have going on with depreciation. Yeah. So it was very popular out West. It's become, sophisticated investors on the East Coast have been doing them for many, many years. In the multifamily world, I think as people start to learn about real estate, and certainly that's the service you're helping provide with your podcast, as they learn about real estate, they learn these tricks. They learn about 1031 exchanges and deferring gain. They learn about cost segregation studies, which allows you to accelerate your depreciation, to reduce to increase your cash flow, by keeping more money in your pocket. So, it's as we see people cycle into real estate, as the stock market took some major hits, although it seems to be coming back up, people are looking for these alternative investments, and real estate seems to be historically, the better option.
Right. And I just want to, make a quick mention here. I know somebody's probably thinking, man, I could do a 1031 and never pay taxes. You're not getting rid of your taxes. You're only deferring them. So just, know that for sure.
Yeah, the one exception to that, which Alex alluded to earlier, is that you are just deferring your taxes, okay? So you're just kicking the can down the road, and hopefully you're building more and more profit from each property you exchange into, one after the other. However, under current tax law, if you drop dead owning that piece of property, your estate gets a step up in the cost basis, and the capital gain, accumulated capital gain, disappears. So we call that the swap till you drop, right? You just continue to swap and swap and swap, and then you drop dead, and your state gets rid of the estate taxes. Rid of the capital gains taxes. You have to watch out for estate taxes.
Yeah.
Right now, we don't worry so much, but those levels, the thresholds where an estate tax kicks in, tend to be rather fluid. And right now, they're at historically high numbers, and so very few people will pay estate taxes, but that could change.
Right. So, so you just said if someone, hypothetically speaking, 1031 every single deal they do until they die, then all of the gains, all the money they made from all of those exchanges is taxed free at that point to the next generation.
Correct. Under current tax law. I have to just add that caveat. The attorney in me makes me say,
right.
keep your eye on what happens, because tax law always changes.
And
that's powerful, man.
This is why this is maybe why there is this thought process about the rich. Is because the rich, I'm putting that in big quotations, right? The rich, well, they're the ones who are, creating this multi-generational strategy, right? And they're thinking about, look, I'll live off passive income from these properties, and then I'll be able to give them over to my children without them having to pay capital gains tax, and essentially bring up that value in that property and save 33% of what the children would have lost to taxes. So that's that multi-generation planning, and people who are thinking about the future. Well, they're doing quite well.
Gotcha. Now, Mike, I'm gonna ask you, because you're the attorney here. Let's say somebody's 1031 and out of a property, and they want to put it into a syndication. Are there any restrictions on investing in syndications when you're going out of a 1031?
Yeah, so it is complicated to do a 1031 into a syndicated deal. And here's the reason. So you have to, in a 1031 exchange, you can only exchange real property for real property. Mm-hmm. Okay. When you do a syndication deal, typically as the passive investor, the limited partner, you're buying an interest in a limited liability company that owns property. Right. There's a distinction there. Okay. So even though the limited liability technically is taxed as a partnership, which is a flow-through entity, meaning the income all flows through to the individual owners.
Right.
It is a separate tax reporting entity. And so what you're buying then is not a piece of property. You're buying a partnership interest, which was specifically excluded from 1031 exchanges. And now after 2018, is just part of everything that's not real estate. So it's not considered a real estate investment. So there's some ways that we see people structuring these deals to get around that. They use something called a tenant in common structure. Yeah. Okay. So a syndicated deal, typically you have one limited liability company. You have a syndicator who is the person who put the deal together. They found the property. She may be the person who is finding all the investors, and she's going to manage the property too. Right. She may have put in little or none of her own money. Okay. And that's where we kind of run into problems. So they buy in a partnership, and the other investors are limited partners, and all they do is they write checks, and hopefully they collect checks at the end of the day. Right. That's right. There's no management. They have no management responsibilities or rights, quite frankly. Yeah. When we do a TIC deal, you cannot buy into somebody else's partnership. You actually have to buy a property interest. Okay, like in the 1031 exchange. So we set up multiple entities. So you'll have your syndicated entity where the syndicator sets it up however she wants and has whatever waterfalls and preferred returns and everything else that she wants to do in that entity. It makes sense for her and for her investors. And then they'll set up a separate entity that will be solely owned by a 1031 investor. Okay, and these two entities will own, or typically limited liability companies will own the properties together. Maybe it's 75% is syndicated, 25% is with the individual as tenants in common. Each owns the property. They enter into what's called a tenant in common agreement. That agreement should follow some of the guidelines that are set forth in a revenue procedure. It's Revenue Procedure 2002-22 for anybody who's taking notes at home. Yeah. And some of the things that relationship has to state is that they have to have proportionate sharing of the profits from the property. Okay, so if you're a 1031 investor, invested 25% of the equity, they have to receive 25% of the profits. Okay, they're also responsible for 25% of the losses. Yeah. Typically, sale rights, it's unanimous consent to sell the property. So there's a bunch of things that are listed in that revenue procedure that you have to look at in structuring your transaction. Right. So that's the way you could do it. It creates some agita for the syndicator because she wants the preferred return, right? She wants to have equity on the backside. She, right. She wants to have management rights, which she loses over to 1031 investor. So sometimes we've seen people maybe, so the 1031 investor sets up a single member LLC, buys the property, but the syndicator is the manager of that entity. She can't own a membership interest, but she can manage it. Right. Maybe that gets around some of the management issues. So there's some things, and I have to stress that if you're putting together something like this, it's essential that you have good tax and legal advice in doing so. Don't just take my word for it. Make sure your accountant and your attorney are comfortable with this structure. And because at the end of the day, as a qualified intermediary, we cannot give tax or legal advice. We just kind of tell you what we see and we'll give you some guidance on what the rules are.
Right. Now, this tenant, this TIC, that's what it's also called. That LLC that's going to be created for the 1031 purposes, let's say there's 5 guys that's doing 1031, could they all put it in this same TIC, or they got to create separate TICs for each person?
Yeah, each person has to have their own separate entity. Okay. So it does become cumbersome. And so, you're not going to do this as a syndicator for somebody who's coming up with 2% of the deal, right? Right. If they're coming up with 25%, and you need that cash to close, right, you're a little bit more flexible. We were talking to an investor a couple of weeks ago where they needed the cash and it was last minute, and they didn't even they had solicited an investor and didn't know that it was 1031 money till the last minute. Right. And so they took on a very small investment, set up this TIC structure, but it probably wasn't worth it at the end of the day. They just felt obligated to because they didn't ask the right questions.
Right. So it's almost like a joint venture with the 1031 buyer because they're bringing so much money to the table. Right. And it only makes sense if, let's say you're raising $3 million, they're going to bring $1 million to the table, in that scenario, I guess that was one will, make more sense because you're going to have to jump through a lot more hoops when you do that strategy. It sounds like from the syndicator's perspective.
Yeah, it's more difficult. And I would agree. At 1/3 of the cash coming in, if I was a syndicator, unless I had access to capital elsewhere, sure, I'd bring them in. Right. Right. 25% maybe, anything under 25%, I'm not so sure.
Yeah. Gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah. So, all right, man. So we kind of talked about it, the broad side of it. So, let's dig into what are the actual rules. When does somebody contact you when they say, hey, it'd be good to do a 1031? Do they contact you after they've already sold the property, or should they call you before they even think about selling?
Yeah. So I'll start this one off, and Mike will take it. So one of the major challenges that we experience and some of the saddest calls that we receive is the individual is so excited about they just heard Willie's podcast and they said this guy Mike and Alex, they were amazing. 1031 deferred taxes dropping, swapping. It's all amazing. I want to be part of it. They said wonderful, but I already sold the property and I already received the funds. Well, at that point, unfortunately, Alex and Michael and any QI would not be able to help because one of the things that's so important is the QI is the intermediary. The whole way that 1031 works is that the seller is not actually receiving funds. As soon as he receives funds from the sale, those funds are taxable. You're actually you're swapping, right? You're swapping the 1031 exchange. Qualified intermediary is the one that's actually purchasing the property for you with the funds that you give it to him from the sale, and it gives you the deed. So in that way, you are essentially deferring the taxes through the 1031. But again, what's so important is to realize is the best time to talk to a QI is really as early as possible, right? Yeah. So if you are thinking about maybe even a year or 2 years away, potentially we have people calling us and talking about their strategy, about how to plan forward, about how they can use a 1031 exchange, because there are crucial deadlines associated with a 1031 exchange that, Mike, do you want to share?
Yeah, so it is time sensitive. And Alex, as Alex said, before you do anything with your property, first of all, you should be talking to your accountant to make sure it makes tax sense. But second, before you close, you have to get us involved, right? We need to set up everything before closing, and the cash from the sale has to come directly to us, so that the taxpayer, for tax purposes, just receive one property for the other. The money flows through us. That's really the secret sauce in the 1031 exchange. So the deadlines are from the closing of the sale.
All right, so talk about the timelines and get back on it.
Yeah, so again, you'll have from the closing of the sale, the timelines are very, very strict. So you only have 45 days from the closing of the sale to identify up to 3 potential properties regardless of value. You could buy multiple properties in a 1031 exchange, but usually you're going to want to limit your identification to 3. If you wanted to go beyond that, then you're limited to identifying up to 200% of the sale price of the property you sold. So if you sold for $1 million, you want to identify 4 properties, you're limited to identifying a total of $2 million of property. Begs the question as to why, and the answer is I don't really know. It's just to make things difficult, I think, for 1031 investors. So you have 45 days to identify and up to 180 days to close. There have been some extensions for the COVID-19 pandemic. Anybody that had a deadline that expires between April 1st and July 15th, their deadline has been extended to July 15th. We think there may be some further extensions. We're waiting to hear from the IRS. I kind of was hoping it would have been last week, but maybe this week we'll get some further guidance. So those are the deadlines, and that's essentially how it works. And then once you're ready to close on your replacement property, we essentially take assignment to that contract. We spend the exchanger's money, and the deed goes directly to the taxpayer completing the exchange.
Yeah. So you have 45 days to identify 3 properties that you potentially want to 1031 into, and the maximum value of those properties can only be 200% above. The maximum is 200% above the price of the property you're selling. Is that the rule? Yeah.
Well, if you only do 3, there's no limit to the value. So you can sell for $1 million. If you only do 3, you can identify $20 million of property.
Okay, gotcha.
If it goes beyond 3, if you knew you were going to buy a bunch of smaller properties, so you're selling your $1 million property, you're going to pick up a bunch of lots for $200,000 a piece.
Yeah. Then
you're limited. You can only identify $2 million of value. For 4 properties or more, up to double.
Gotcha. And the total timeline for this is 180 days, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. So, the investor needs to reach out to you guys, before they decide to buy. Talk to their CPA, make sure it makes sense, and then reach out to you guys, and you're gonna, kind of walk them through, exactly what they need to do, in regards to working with you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we do, and we're available. I always say, Alex and I both always, we would be considered a resource for people in the real estate industry. So even if we're not involved in the deal, we're more than happy to answer questions. That's kind of what we do all day long, is talk to people, answer their questions, kind of walk them through the process. So, we hope to continue to provide that service. Yeah.
So what happens? Let's say they say, hey man, I want to do the 1031 exchange. And for whatever reason, that the market, like pre-COVID, man, it was hard to find a deal that penciled. So what do you do if you can't find a deal that makes sense? What are your options at that point?
So there's several options, right? Let's just talk about the worst case scenario. What is the worst case scenario? God forbid, right? The worst case scenario, what's going to happen is that the 1031 exchange doesn't work out. You received your funds back from the qualified intermediary, and you'd be liable in the capital gains tax, right? Yeah. So that's the worst case scenario. And some individuals even use it because if the 1031 exchange timeline goes to the next tax year, they do that sometimes in order to defer their taxes on that income until next year, right? So say they had a really good year that year, so they're going to push off the proceeds of the 1030 of the sale from 1031 onto the next year. So that's like the worst case scenario, and you'd be surprised. People think that this is a very expensive tool to use. Actually, it's typical industry standard is around $800 for a typical standard 1031 exchange. So that's the worst case scenario. Now, the other options that are available would be two options. One option that it would be to do a cost segregation study from a different property, and this is from our friend Weiss. He's he really loves for him.
Right.
He's Mr. 1031, the cost seg king. So what would happen is you can offset the income from the sale by doing cost segregation study and accelerate the depreciation from a different property that you've purchased, right? So they can offset one another. That's a strategy. And perhaps, Mike, do you want to talk about opportunity zone, perhaps?
I was going to mention, one other thing you could do, you could always name as a backup something called the Delaware Statutory Trust. Yeah. So Delaware Statutory Trusts are basically institutional grade property that 1031 investors will buy a fractional interest in. So they may own a shopping center or, medical facility or a retirement community or an industrial place or a warehouse. And you can buy in with these, buy into these transactions, and you could buy a small percentage. It could be 1%, 2%, 5%. It's kind of custom made for whatever your needs are for your 1031 exchange. So you could either do that as your main investment and allow you to diversify amongst several different types of, other managed property, other people manage them. Or you can name them as a backup, for whatever you may have a property in mind, and in case it falls through, you have this as a committed investor to use those programs, but that can be a very valuable tool. The qualified opportunity zone, I think, is less of a backup for people in 1031 exchanges, but it's another option that's out there. The deadlines tend to be somewhat synonymous with 1031, so it makes it difficult to use it as a fallback. But it might work, if you let's say you entered into a 1031 exchange, you did not identify any property in 45 days, you'll get your money back day 46. You have to invest in a qualified opportunity zone 180 days from your sale also. So you might still be able to do a qualified opportunity zone. And that allows you to invest in, very briefly, because we could do a whole podcast on this, but in a lower income community, you could buy real estate or start a business in the opportunity zone. Has to be an area that's been designated as an opportunity zone, and you just basically deploy your capital gain, and you could buy a building. You do have to substantially bought it for $500,000. You have to add another $500,001 of improvements to it, so it's going to be a gut rehab most likely. Or you can set up a business, so you can set up a business there and buy all kinds of new equipment and bring it into the zone. So that's an option for some investors also. And the nice thing about that is that it's not only available for gain from real estate, but you can sell stock and take your gain and go invest in an opportunity zone. You can sell collectible artwork. You could take your mint 1970 Chevy Chevelle SS that you sold on the Barrett Jackson auto auction, and you can take the proceeds from that and you can go invest in an opportunity zone.
Wow.
Or perhaps a Willie Smith rookie card.
Willie Smith rookie card could work too.
Let's not forget about valuable things here.
Right. Absolutely. So real quick, man, the Delaware Trust, could you elaborate on that? I mean, that's something I just recently heard about, but it's something that, I don't know a lot about it. I'm sure a lot of other people don't. What exactly is it? So it's not a syndication?
So not really. So it's typically you have institutional companies, professional real estate management companies or real estate owners. There's a couple out there. The biggest players in the industry, and this is not a promotion for anybody, but the biggest players are Inland Capital and Pasco. There's a bunch of others out there. Yeah. And essentially you buy a fractional interest. So they buy a property and they buy it in the name of a land trust set up typically under Delaware law. they can then sell off beneficial interest in the trust. And there's a Rev ruling from 2004 that says that that's the same as buying the underlying property. So it's different than like your syndicated deal where I just told you cannot buy a partnership interest.
Right.
This is kind of a carve out from that and says you can buy a beneficial interest in a Delaware statutory trust that owns property, and it will qualify if it's structured correctly.
Right.
And so you get away from that management. You don't have to worry about those 3 T's, the tenants, the trash, and the toilet. So as a result, it tends to be a better investment for people who are looking to get hiring people. Or somebody who's gotten burned by a bad tenant might be a good candidate for them. They're all out there, right? So that's where we see them coming into play. As I said, it's kind of off-the-shelf property. It's kind of custom-made for 1031 investors, and it's it's a valid play. If you're somebody who's active, that wants to do value add and stuff like that, or perhaps refinance and pull equity out, the Delaware Statutory Trust doesn't really make sense. But for the right investor, it can be a game changer.
Yeah, so these are typically REITs, companies on that level that's setting these up.
Yeah, they're like REITs. They're not, you cannot buy a REIT in a 1031 exchange, but this is somewhat similar to buying a REIT. A REIT actually is viewed as a security, and for 1031 purposes, you cannot buy directly into a REIT. There is something called, and a whole nother, open up another can of worms, something called a Section 721 up REIT, where you could essentially buy into a Delaware statutory trust that might be brought into a REIT, and at the end of the day, you would wind up owning shares in a private REIT instead of owning property. That would, foreclose the ability to do any further 1031 exchanges, but it would get you out of real estate and into more like a security.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, man, that was, I just wanted to dig a little deeper in that. I know a lot of people probably scratching their head right now.
Yeah, I realize. I apologize.
No, it's good, man. It's good to know.
It's a rabbit hole. We're just starting to go down.
Yeah, we, on the Madison 1031 Zone blog, which I write most of the articles on, we have a pretty good article on Delaware Statutory Trusts if anybody wants to kind of dig a little deeper and learn more about that, or they can contact us.
Right. Well, if you guys can send me the link, I'll definitely put that in the show notes.
Sure.
Absolutely. Good deal, man. So what are some other things around 1031 that people just kind of need to be thinking about or need to be aware of that we haven't covered just yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important mind is the importance of planning. And we talked about getting into a syndicated deal. The flip side of that is getting out of any type of partnership, either a syndicated deal or a more closely held partnership. Again, if you own property with other people, you own a partnership interest. And if you own the limited liability company, you own a partnership interest, which is not exchangeable. So to get out, when the property is sold, to separate, you have to do some advanced planning as well. So you can do something that we call a drop and swap, which you really need to have some time to put together. But essentially what you would do is you would take that partnership, that limited liability company, and you would dissolve it and distribute the property to the members as tenants in common. Kind of the flip side of what we just talked about. And then as tenants in common, each individual investor can go do their own separate thing. So some people could go do an exchange, other people could go pay taxes and then use the proceeds to, go to the Barrett-Jackson auto auction and buy that 1970s Chevelle SS with the 454. That would be a valid thing, and they can separate that way.
I think just two things that briefly we want to just make clear also is that just keep in mind that we're talking about only investment properties, right? I want to make sure we understand that. So you may have a beautiful home and your personal home has appreciated in value. Typically you would not be able to do a 1031, and actually a 121 exemption will probably be a better solution for that sale. But so that's just remember that we're typically dealing with only a 1031 for investment property for another investment property. So you can't just do a 1031 into a property and then immediately move in yourself and live there, right? So that's something that is important to note. And I think another point.
Well, hold on. Let me pause you there. If someone is doing something.
Pause. you just did. You just paused me. That's it. I got nothing to say.
Yeah, man. Sorry, I had to interrupt you, man. So
you're the host. You could
Right. So if somebody's doing a house hacking strategy where they're, say they're buying a fourplex and they're moving in one unit and renting out the other 3 units, could they 1031 a property like that or no?
Sorta. So the way that works is you can only 1031 the investment portion. So let's say you were selling a warehouse.
Yeah.
And you wanted to buy a fourplex and you were going to live in one of the 4 units. You could 1031 into 3 of the units, but you cannot use the proceeds from the 1031 to essentially pay for the value of the 4th unit. Okay. That has to be separate. Typically, the way we see this, the best example I have of this was my grandparents. My grandparents came to this country from Europe in the early 1950s, right after World War II. And they bought a 6-family house in an area in Queens, New York called Ridgewood. It's an old German neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And they bought this and they basically raised their 8 children in one of the 6 units. Amazingly enough, they did that. I don't know if people slept on the roof. I'm not sure exactly how they were able to accomplish that.
You'd be surprised how comfortable a bathtub could be.
Yeah, I guess, and big beds. So they did that, and they owned that property until they passed away in their 90s. And I actually rented across the hall. It was they had vacant apartments at the time. When I went to law school, I rented the apartment across the hall from them. Wow. I would come out, and they were only in their 80s then. They were really young then. And my grandmother would be hanging out the windows, cleaning, from the windowsill, the outside of the windows. And my grandfather, there was a staircase that was, I don't know if everybody's going to see the video, but it was like a 45-degree angle staircase, and he would be hanging out over that staircase with a paint roller because they kept this place immaculate. Wow. And we would have loved for them to have sold that property and done something that was a little bit more relaxing. Yeah. Of course, that's why they lived to be in their 90s. That was what they lived for. They loved taking care of things like that. So, but if they had sold it, they could have done a 1031 exchange on 5 of the units and bought something like that, where it's passive and should have given them cash flow. And then on the value of their apartment, because it was their primary residence, as Alex said, under Section 121 of the tax code, they could have excluded up to $500,000 worth of gain as a married couple, tax-free. And so that would have been a very, very useful technique. So, that's what we kind of see in that fourplex situation.
Gotcha. Yeah, man, that's interesting. I never knew that. And I got one more question around the 1031, and you guys can say whatever else you need to say after that. But let's say somebody's wanting to do a joint venture, because as you know, man, doing a syndication, man, the fees associated with it could be anywhere from $15,000 to $30,000, and it's a smaller deal, maybe $1 million or so. It doesn't make sense to syndicate it, so a joint venture makes a whole lot more sense. What does a 1031 look like for an investor that maybe wants to partner with me to do a deal?
Well, I think if you're bringing 1031 money to 1031 at the end of that rainbow when the project sells, you don't want to set it up as a limited liability company or one limited liability company. You want to set it up as a TIC right from the get-go. Mm-hmm. Right. Especially if you're talking about a small deal, probably everybody is, it probably is going to be proportionate sharing of debt and expenses and everything else. So I would go into a TIC structure, let everybody set up their own LLC, take their percentage interest in the property. Yeah. You have a good solid TIC agreement governing the relationships. Obviously, the most important thing in any transaction, I think anywhere, is that, the paper's all well and good. Those documents and the legal documents and everything else are great. You have to know the people you're investing with. Yeah. Right. And so, judgment of character or failing to judge character may be the biggest cause of failed real estate investment or any investment than anything else. You could it's like COVID-19 times 50 if you have a bad partner. So, make sure you have good people to invest with. But that's the way I would structure it. And if I knew that either money in or money going out was eligible for 1031.
Cool. Good deal, man. Is there anything else you guys want to share with us about the 1031?
Just one more thing to add is flipping is very popular, but could not be used for 1031 purposes. Right? That's also important to know is that look, people really love to watch TLC, I think it's, or TBS, all these shows.
Right.
All the twins and all the wonderful, beautiful people who flip things, right?
Property Brothers, right?
Property Brothers, is that what they are? My
Yeah.
gosh, I just think they're so handsome. But those handsome men are not doing 1031s, because a 1031 has to be purpose of investment, which usually would be a holding pattern of a minimum of 2 tax years.
Okay.
Right, so that's something really important. You want to be like the handsome brothers? Yeah, God bless you. But you're not going to be able to do a 1031 at the end of that sale.
Right.
Yeah, 2 years, and it should be, the intention about should be for rental. If you intended to just kind of fix it up and hold it for 2 years so you get over some magic, threshold, that's not necessarily going to do it. You want to actually actively at least attempt to rent the property during those 2 years.
Right. Got you. Well, yeah, man, I really appreciate you guys coming on the show today and dropping knowledge on 1031s and Delaware Trust and dropping the pin, the 1031s and the DSTs and the ticks. Man, there's a lot of great value you guys provided, and I'm going to listen to this podcast a couple times myself. But tell my listeners how can they get up with you, Alex and Blake? What's the best way to get up with you guys?
Yeah, so the easiest way to get in touch with me is LinkedIn. So I'm there all the time, Alex Shandrovsky. And a great way to get in touch with Mike is mbrady@massive1030.com or LinkedIn as well. So we are really available to serve your community, having these conversations. And as you can see from both our style, we both try to keep it, we want to give it legal advice, but at the same time, we try to keep it as enjoyable of a conversation as possible, because investment could be stressful, and you need to have great partners like Willie to make the experience enjoyable.
Absolutely. Good deal, man. Well, man, I appreciate you guys coming on, sharing with us, and let's definitely stay in touch.
Absolutely. This is great. Thanks, Willie.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Willie.
Thank you for listening to the Generational Wealth Through Commercial Real Estate podcast, brought to you by Onyx Capital Investments. Onyx Capital Investments works with investors nationwide to invest in income-producing real estate in emerging markets. Connect online at www.onyxcapitalinvestments.com to learn more about what we're doing. If we have added value to your life, please leave us a review.